Hey scientists, it's Jessica Power, one of the science curriculum coordinators at Kansas City Public Schools. Scientists, the last couple of weeks we have talked about weather. We talked about what is weather, the types of weather that we see. We talked about meteorologists and what they do for their job. And we also talked about weather data. We collected weather data, we turned some of that weather data into a bar graph, and we looked and talked about how scientists or meteorologists use that weather data along with other maps to predict or forecast our weather. Well, scientists, we're going to add to that this week. But instead of talking about weather that changes day to day and hour to hour, we're going to talk about seasons. Now, we're currently in fall. So there's a lot of things that are happening during the fall. But scientists, our year from January to December is actually cut out into 4 different seasons. And those seasons are right behind me. So let's take a look. Scientists, we have spring, summer, fall, and winter. And right now, we're in fall, as we've talked about. So you might notice that the trees around you, they've started to go from green to yellow to orange to red to brown, and those leaves are slowly starting to fall off the trees. You also probably noticed that plants that were thriving or flowers that were growing during the summer, they're not growing anymore. And as we start to get closer and closer to winter, our trees look more and more like skeletons because there's no leaves on them during the winter. Well, what are these seasons? What do we see during these seasons? What do we experience? And what is a season anyways? Why are there 4? That's what we're going to talk about today, scientists. So let's go back to this definition. Now, this definition might be a little confusing to start with, but I promise by the end of our time together today, you will understand seasons. Here we go. Scientists, seasons are parts of the year that have different amounts of daylight. Daylight. Let's think about that. Scientists, in the summer, when you went to sleep, it probably was still light outside. And when you woke up, it was light outside. Now, scientists, in the wintertime, when you wake up, it's dark outside. And when you go to sleep, it's dark outside. Which tells us that there are different amounts of daylight, or the hours of day that we can experience sunlight changes. Now, scientists, our seasons have everything to do with the amount of daylight we have. In fact, you can look at a data table, which we're actually going to create next week, and predict what happens to the sunlight the further into a season we go. Let's go back to our chart to get an overview of the seasons. So scientists, I'm going to start with fall because that's where we're at right now. And it's a little bit easier to understand the seasons if we start with the one that we're currently in. So scientists, we're in fall. And as I talked about, you probably see the changes that are occurring during fall. We talked about the leaves that come off the trees. Those leaves change colors. The plants that you usually see during the summer and spring no longer around. And scientists, you even may start to notice that you see fewer and fewer animals. That's right. Some of the animals start to hibernate, or they start to not spend as much time wandering around outside as they usually do. Now, during fall, there's a couple things that happen. The first thing that happens is that every day of fall, we experience or we get less and less sunlight. That means when fall started, we had a lot of sunlight. But now, as we're getting towards the end of fall, we don't have very much. So fall is really a season where we start to see a huge change in the length of the time the sun is out during the day. And that impacts our temperature, it impacts our weather, and it impacts what happens to the plants and animals in the environments around us. Now, scientists, also during the fall, it gets colder. In September, you probably were still wearing a t-shirt, maybe shorts, maybe if you had to, a light jacket. But scientists, as we get closer and closer to winter, it's getting colder, which means we have to put on coats, We have to sometimes put on gloves. We have to make sure we're not wearing sandals, right? Because the colder it gets, the more we need to stay warm. So even during fall, we also see a change in temperature. Now fall turns into winter. And in the wintertime, scientists, it's really cold. And I put on this poster, scientists, it's dark. Because we don't get very many hours of daylight. The sun starts to set around 4 or 5 o'clock. By 6 o'clock, it's dark. So we have a lot of dark or nighttime. We typically see snow as a type of precipitation. And we even get ice. I could have added sleet to winter. I didn't. I thought snow and ice would be fine for our weather or precipitations that we experience. Now you'll notice here that there are no trees, no leaves on those trees. And in the wintertime, you'll see that. Now there are some trees like evergreen trees. And those actually have little needles on them, like pine trees. So pine trees have little needles, and those needles are different than our leafy trees. They're a different type of tree. But for the most part, majority of the trees that we have around Kansas City, they're going to lose their leaves. And during the winter time, those leaves stay off. Now, once we get to the end of winter, we start to go into spring. Now, spring is similar to fall, but spring is the opposite, meaning the opposite thing happens. In the fall, it gets colder outside, and we get less and less sunlight. But in the springtime, it gets warmer outside. We get closer and closer to summer, which means we get more and more sunlight. In the beginning of spring, it's still a lot of darkness. There's still a lot of nighttime. But by the end of spring, we have mostly sunlight during the day. You'll start to notice that the trees, some plants start to grow and come back. The environment looks more green in the springtime. And then finally, scientists, we transition into summer. And during the summer, we see the most amount of sunlight. Like I said at the beginning of our time together, when you wake up, it's sunny. When you go to bed, it's sunny or light outside because we experience more sunlight. We see lots of sunlight. We typically see some thunderstorms, right? It's really humid, meaning there's a lot of water droplets in the air. And it's typically really, really hot. So scientists, summer and winter are similar because they're extremes. Meaning in the winter, it's really, really cold, and in the summer, it's really, really hot. Now, spring and fall, they're also similar because they're changes. There's lots of changes that happen during those seasons. Again, in fall, the leaves start to fall off. It begins to get colder, and the temperature gradually decreases during the fall. And in the springtime, we start to see more sunlight, and the temperature gradually increases to get us closer to summer. So scientists, we have 4 seasons. We just talked about the description or what each season is like, but I'm going to go back to our definition. Because if you've noticed, I've talked a lot about sunlight. I've talked a lot about the amount of light that we have during the course of a day during each season. So our definition, again, scientists, is our seasons are parts of the year that have different amounts of daylight. And by daylight, I mean hours of the day that we experience the sun. Now, scientists, I'm going to go and I'm going to challenge us for the next couple minutes because I'm going to show you a globe. And that globe represents the earth where we live. And scientists, I'm going to show you kind of why we have these seasons. So scientists, here's my globe. And you will notice that when I put my globe can spin. Okay, it spins around. But scientists, you also might notice that there's a red line that goes around this globe. Now scientists, in a typical sphere, this is a sphere, it's a circle, a 3-dimensional circle. This red line, if I wanted it to go perfectly in a straight line around the globe, I would move the globe like this. You have the North Pole, and you have the South Pole in the very bottom. Now this red line, scientists, that goes around the globe that you see on here, this represents the equator. And the equator is the very center of our Earth. And it's an imaginary line. Now, scientists, this isn't how the Earth is in space. It's not straight up and down with the North Pole pointing straight up and the South Pole pointing straight down. And the equator doesn't run in a line like this. In fact, in space, our Earth is tilted. Did you notice what happened? The equator now looks like it's almost a little bit diagonal. Our North Pole is over here, and our South Pole is now down here. Now we could draw a line from our North Pole to our South Pole. Pretend I put a pole in it, right? If I put a stick or a pole that goes through the North Pole to the South Pole, it would make a diagonal line. Now this is called a tilt. So remember how I had the equator as a nice straight line that went side to side? The Earth sits on a tilt. And as the Earth spins, different parts of the world get different amounts of daylight during the year. And those different amounts of daylight during the parts of the year are why we have seasons. So scientists, because our Earth sits on a tilt, right? That means it kind of sits diagonally. That means different parts of the Earth experience different amounts of daylight or sunlight during different parts of the year. That's one reason why right now in the fall, it's starting to get darker and darker and darker. Because if we go back to our globe, as the Earth moves, so the Earth spins, but it also moves this way around the sun. You'll notice that in the wintertime, the part of the Earth that's really facing away or doesn't get as much sunlight, they're experiencing the winter. And the part of the Earth that gets the most sunlight during different periods of the year, they're experiencing summer. So scientists, there's 4 seasons in a year. Seasons are just parts of the year that have different amounts of daylight. Scientists, next week, we're going to take this idea of seasons and we're going to look at some more data. We're going to look at a data table that shows us sunrise and sunset times and the amount of daylight that we experience throughout the course of a few months. So I'll see you back here next week, scientists. Have a great day.